Hello, and welcome to Mobility Field Day exclusive at Aruba Atmosphere 2019. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am an event lead for Tech Field Day, and we are here at Aruba Atmosphere in sunny, not quite blisteringly hot Las Vegas, Nevada, to cover a little bit of some exciting technology announcements and some things that are going on in the wireless mobility, security, networking, IoT space. It seems that our friends at Aruba, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company, have really gotten involved in a lot of things. We've had a lot of great discussions so far this week. We've seen a lot of exciting technology in the keynote, and we, as Mobility Field Day exclusive delegates, have had some closed-door sessions with some of the brain trust that works at Aruba, and we've got some exciting things we want to bring to you. So we are going to go ahead and get started with our panel here. And the first topic that I'd like to bring up is actually a hot topic that came from WLPC, run by our friend Keith Parsons. It's OpenConfig. So if you're not familiar with this technology, OpenConfig is essentially a standardized northbound API. And now that you've gone and looked up what that is,
Two-way.
it's two-way.
You can do streaming telemetry from it too.
That's right. But they're standardizing the northbound interface on devices. Now, OpenConfig started in the data center, and a lot of people wanted to standardize the interface between switches and controllers, but it's being adapted to Wi-Fi. And I was not at WLPC, but a lot of the folks up here were, and there was a lot of chatter about the excitement around OpenConfig. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this question out to the panel. When it comes to OpenConfig, how important is it really to standardize the northbound interface between an AP and whatever device is telling it what to do?
Ryan, why don't you?
Yeah, go for this, Ryan.
I think it's important because a lot of the problems that are getting solved in the networking world in general are by developing these open tools. Ansible, Puppet Chef, all of that's out there for deployment, configuration, monitoring, troubleshooting. And in the wireless world, we have what? Nothing. No open tools. We are stuck with a vendor solution. If we change vendors, if we decide that in a certain area of our environment, maybe one vendor would be better than another for a point-to-point link as opposed to our enterprise wireless, or for monitoring the network from telemetry standpoint, performance, location services, all the different things we can do with wireless, we're locked into one entire ecosystem. And there's no flexibility. We can't develop and adapt on top of their proprietary tools because we don't get the source code. So I think that's why the push is happening. It's starting in large organizations because that's where the pressure is being felt the most. But I'm hoping that it trickles down.
Well, that's actually one of the things that I kind of want to talk about here, is because a lot of large organizations are trying to create tool sets and DevOps type mentalities that allow them to execute small amounts of code to affect larger amounts of hardware. But I also remember when the whole SDN conversation came up and the networking people got super, super excited for a while, and the wireless community was like, I don't care. Because you guys already have seen a lot of that technology being integrated into what you do, with the idea of having a centralized database of configuration pushed down to unintelligent endpoints. So why is OpenConfig so exciting when other forms of programmability have not in the past? Is it the ability to have a neutral interface?
Absolutely. On the point of choosing what's best for your environment, you could completely abstract from the hardware your configuration. You have an access point from Aruba, and say you have a really long point-to-point link that you need a microwave dish for, and it uses OpenConfig. You just push the same config out to it for everything, except radio power channels, stuff like that, that's going to be customized. You want to develop your own RRM algorithm, you can do it, and you can do it multi-vendor. You can do it across all these access points because you're taking away the hardware. When it comes to troubleshooting, you don't care what access point, what radio, what model it is. You're looking at the raw data coming off of the radios, things like that. It's not. So like you said with SDN, we already knew software-defined networking. You had your controllers and your access points and everything was spread out. The networking world, data center specifically, came up behind us, learned from that as much as they could, and then just leapfrogged right past the wireless community. There hasn't been any innovation on the management side of wireless network. It's done the exact same way. We've done it for a decade or two.
And that's a really interesting point, because when you think about it, Wi-Fi is more standardized than anything else, right? Everything has to follow 802.11, right? Yeah, we've got 802 or 802.3 on the Ethernet side, but that's because it's wired. There's so much more so many different overlays and other technologies that can be squeezed in there. But from an access point to client, or to station, anything in that path has to follow 802.11, which means all of the components are nearly identical, and it makes it that much easier for us to do those types of
Well, they are nearly identical on the protocol side, yet the management platforms do them entirely differently.
Right.
You put in your transmit power as a power level, as EIRP, as dBm, as milliwatts, and yet the actual effect to the radio is identical. So one of the things OpenConfig gives you the ability to have a standardized way to talk and manage your network.
Exactly.
Both downstream to control configs, but also upstream. You could set an OpenConfig standard management interface to help you do troubleshooting. And it doesn't matter which vendor's underneath, you still have the same standards.
Yeah,
So
and you're getting the same data back. That's
exactly the same.
Comparable.
Yeah.
So it could be in Aruba, it could be some off-the-shelf, TP-Link running OpenWRT, and you're going to get the radio stats off of it. You're going to see all of that information and be able to troubleshoot, not based on the vendor and the radio, but based on the tools and the knowledge of 802.11.
So Eddie, go ahead. I want to.
Well, I just want to say, how many people here have heard of OpenConfig? All right, so a relatively small amount of people have actually even heard of it.
Hold on. How many of you were at WLPC and heard about it there?
About half of those.
About half.
So the reason I'm asking that question is because, like Ryan, for example, he comes from a background where he's been doing, programming and Python scripts and all kinds of stuff for a long time, and I don't have that background, and every time I got involved and tried to kind of learn it, in my head, I couldn't wrap. What is the purpose of this? Why am I doing this? And they're like, it's so easy. It's simple. You can push out configs and do all kinds of really cool stuff. It wasn't until I went to WLPC this year and there was some discussion about OpenConfig, but I went to one of the deep dives where I actually saw the practical use case. And the practical use case was exactly what Ryan said, where I can have a config that literally it's one script, one config that has all my stuff for AP names and power and all that stuff. And I could have an Aruba at this hospital, and maybe they have Cisco at this hospital, and maybe they have Maru at this hospital, right? We'd want them to have all Aruba, right? But in this case, this is a hypothetical scenario where we have 3 different platforms. I can use that one script and centralize, have a common config that I can literally push out to those 3 different platforms because they use the same terminology. If you look at the script, it's human readable. And that was the first time I actually saw something where I was like, oh, wait, this makes sense to me now. Instead of going to the UI or instead of going to the CLI and putting these commands, I can literally build something and say, oh, this is radio name. I'll put the name here. This is radio power. I'll put the power there. All the things I needed to do and push it out, and it doesn't matter what the vendor is. So OpenConfig is a standard that lots of companies, Google is one of the companies that's spearheading, Apple's involved, a bunch of other companies are involved, Microsoft, and Aruba actually does have support. It's limited support, right, but they do have some support, and so the whole point of why this is coming up is we're trying to see how can we make this more common throughout the industry, because I think once you see it, you get this your eyes go like this and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is really cool. This is something that I didn't think I could do. And all of a sudden, and this is coming from a guy, I'm not a programmer, I don't know any, I've never even done that before in my life. And all of a sudden.
How long was your deep dive?
But
just a couple hours you were able to do it.
So
I actually was there for 2 hours. I couldn't stay any longer because I had work to do. And that was enough for me to say, I gotta learn this.
But Eddie,
this is amazing. And I actually did a configuration in those.
You didn't need to understand programming to implement SNMP monitoring.
So I'm just going to cut in quickly because I'm not great at patience. Firstly, I'm just going to answer something, but secondly, they have a question.
Okay.
So, I work in security. My background is networks, and I moved into wireless along the way before I went to security. And what thing that really stands out to me, and what you guys are all touching on but not saying, is the simplification of this technology is what's going to make the difference and allowing us to be more open. I mean, the website itself, literally, if you go to openconfig.net/project/Wi-Fi, the thing that really stood out to me was a vendor's ability to differentiate should not be based on the proprietary CLR or MIB tree, nor should it be the format of their API. Essentially, you're not going to be able to say, we're best because of this proprietary technology we have. It's going to be, this is how we work together to make a better solution for everyone holistically, so that then we can specialize in different ways.
All right, Sam, you've got a question.
Practically speaking, if I'm a single vendor environment, why would I bother using OpenConfig versus like my vendor's built-in NMS platform?
So that is a fantastic question, Sam. One of the problems I'm running into, I run a fairly large network. When I say large, I mean we're going to approach 100,000 access points in the next couple of years. Vendor management tools don't work for me. They simply don't. There isn't a management platform for my network, and I have to build my own. Well, I can't when I have to worry about all these proprietary APIs all over the place. I need a common language, a common syntax. Yeah, I mean, how many times have you been in a conversation with someone that works with Cisco gear and you said ARM or air match and they had no idea what you were talking about? We shouldn't have to care about the vendor-specific syntax. I should be able to hit my radios and get how many clients are on there, what are their capabilities, what's my channel utilization. I should be able to get all of that for basic monitoring, and I should be able to do some more advanced stuff like the vendor solutions that aren't built for me.
And I'll add a point to that, and then we'll get to your question. Remember that single vendor does not always mean single OS, single hardware. So if you've ever had to deal with a situation where a config command changed between versions, disappeared between versions, a company got bought and suddenly that's the new standard for everything we're deploying in 2021, that's the magic of being able to have a unified configuration system, is so that you don't have to worry about your product getting end of life because nobody knows how to program the CLI that went with it anymore.
I would also like to point out, I'll be really quick though, I'd also like to point out that maybe you're vendor specific at this point in time. As the company grows and different priorities and cost considerations, it's very rare, in my experience, to find out or to find an organization that literally has only one vendor. It's very rare. So I don't think that's...
What's your question?
So excluding the obvious of I have far too many things and the NMS doesn't work for me, when you have a multi-vendor solution, I love this idea, but I'm terrified of the general idea of like, I have Aruba and OpenWRT. On the Aruba, the controls are, I want to have power level minimum of this and maximum of this, and the OpenWRT gives me one option. Like, the experience across the multi-vendor network sounds kind of terrifying because, in fact, they don't match up. Turning on things like 802.11w or 802.11r especially doesn't match up across vendors. Sometimes they don't support it.
I would like to say that at the moment, yes, they don't match up. But do you think that with this new technology or this shift in how we view it, do you think that possibly vendors will be forced to align with it and forced to have these options because people will choose what works for them effectively?
I want you to hold that thought for 1 second, and I want to get a couple more comments, and then we'll come right back to that, okay? Keith?
Oh, I was just going to answer your question. It's up to the vendor to write their interface between what they're capable of and the OpenConfig standard. So they have the ability to say, we can't do this, this, and this. And it's just no.
And they just don't expose those options.
Yeah, they don't expose. So you might have a config and you'll get back an error message saying, you asked me to do this, I can't. And so it is able to be across not just vendors, but capabilities. Because even within a vendor, you have an 8 radio and a 2 radio, and you're going to have to deal with that either way.
Yeah, because Aruba does have some support for OpenConfig, but they made the decision. They went to they looked at the OpenConfig platform. They said, oh, these are all the options that OpenConfig has. We'll match up with these options, but we're not going to match up with these. So these are the only things you can do. So you wouldn't be able to actually throw a command and make something happen unless the vendor supported that option.
So we all know that no matter how slick and fast the vendor's horse is, you can lead it to water, but you can't make it drink. If you want OpenConfig to get adopted in the industry and be a standard, and we're fighting this in the networking world right now, how do you bring the players to the table? Because let's be fair, for every OpenWRT and for every hobby kit OS that develops this, it don't mean jack squat if Aruba and Cisco aren't supporting it. So how do we make that happen?
It's how OpenConfig Consortium has done it. They picked off Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and said, if you want to play in our world, you will support this by this date. And if you want to sell into there, and they have big things. Us with smaller, even your size, you could put a little bit of pressure on, but you're nothing compared to a Google.
Right, but as a customer, why, or as a vendor selling to customers who have no idea what OpenConfig is, why would I? Why wouldn't I want to sell you my proprietary NMS? Why wouldn't I want you to have to buy my IPs? Why
on the flip side of that, if you push for OpenConfig in the industry and you create your own NMS that's multi-vendor and can use OpenConfig to tap those other vendors, you've now got a foothold into the competitor's market where, remember how we said the access point on the edge doesn't matter anymore? Now I can just start swapping them in. And you can win accounts because of it.
I would also like to add that businesses like the ever sexy certifications and like audits and checkboxes. And the one thing I like about the idea of OpenConfig is as you add these, we can do this, this, and this, you can then audit that really effectively and say, does your system do this, this, and this? And so whilst maybe an organization isn't like, well, this is the best for my tech, so I'm going to use it. It might be they don't effectively communicate the benefits. They will say, actually, if this is a requirement in regulation or directives, this is going to make a difference. We're going to check those boxes and it'll be easier to audit and less challenging to miss things. So.
On top of that, Nginx was just bought by F5. Nginx is a web server. What differentiates it from Aruba or from Apache or Tomcat or any other web server out there? They all answer 200, 404, 501. They all speak the same exact language to the end user.
They don't care what the browser is. They don't care what hardware they're running on.
Why should wireless be so special that it's that much different than every other technology in our industry?
That's a great point.
And well, I mean, we have databases that all speak a common language, even though they're different products.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard, to your point, I would argue, what difference does it make if the underlying infrastructure is running OpenConfig or not? Look at the Aruba 8400, and the GUI is actually making a whole bunch of RESTful API calls to the back end. It turns out that when you build a standard, you can build tool sets on top of that standard internally that are much easier to manage and maintain, because when your development team leaves to go found a startup, you don't have to rewrite the GUI from scratch every time.
I agree, but if I'm in a 9-month product release cycle, and do I need to worry about trying to get in the open standard in this?
Now, OpenConfig also leaves options open and the ability for vendors to insert their own proprietary options, their own proprietary endpoints in the model.
Right, then we'll end up with open API for Aruba, open API for
Let me look at it, but with standard elements.
Hold on just a second, because we're kind of in this conversation on the networking side with telemetry coming down. So telemetry is the word, but every vendor is doing telemetry somewhat differently. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a telemetry kind of agreed upon thing, but if you go to Cisco, they're doing it completely different than the other vendors. And with my concern with it is we end up with different SNMP MIBs for these open configs.
OpenConfig
different and different.
OpenConfig is a consortium that has no vendors involved in it.
Right.
It's versioned It's there's pull requests. It gets all of the information from the community that manages it. If Aruba comes in and says, we want to add this custom endpoint for ours, and this is what it is, the consortium can look at it and go, no, that's just the channel setting.
Scott.
Let's break it out and look at it this way. Everybody in the room is probably an Aruba customer in some shape, form, or fashion. How many of you are still running 6X? How many of you had the pain of going from 6X to 8X recently? Would it have not been great had you just been able to export that configuration out of 6X and push it directly into 8X without the need of a conversion tool or something like that in order to immediately go to 8X? As a customer, you're going from Cisco Wi-Fi or Aruba Wi-Fi version X to this. There's major changes in CLI commands. Air match didn't exist in 6X. We've now solved your problem.
But as Cisco, I don't want you going to Aruba.
Yeah,
Okay, but
this is vendor agnostic.
Because here's the thing. When you think about, if we start talking about Wi-Fi security, and we start talking about radius server, you get to go choose best in breed radius server, the radius server that's right for you that will work in your installation. If we're in an open config environment where the majority of vendors support it, then I get to go buy the best in breed configuration management and monitoring tool, which Aruba wants to play in, Cisco would want to play in. They want to put out a product that is best in breed in that class that they can then manage. They don't care who the AP is at that point, right? So now we're choosing.
Well, they do from a business perspective, but not from.
But from a management perspective, that licensing that they're gonna make us pay through the teeth for, right?
Look at how much support they have right now.
You're decoupling all of those requirements.
So I would love to let this go for the next 3 days, because I think we could do that, but I do have a couple of other topics that we want to make sure that we cover. So if you want to learn a little bit more about OpenConfig and what it's doing, not only in the networking space, but also in Wi-Fi, head over to openconfig.net, check it out. And honestly, if you're a customer who is wanting to support OpenConfig, you should go talk to your SEs, talk to your AMs, tell them that this is something that you want. Be the change that you want in the industry.